Hey everybody, hope everybody's doing well and that their summer's going well and that you're enjoying the class. I'm going to sort of cut right to the chase I should say. Um, so again, it's already been a wonderful experience for me to read through all the work that you guys are doing. And so I want to sort of I'll try and keep this uh, around 10 to 15 minutes. There's a number of ideas that got brought up, both in particular in the collaborative reading we did about Think Different Together with the Emerson and the de Tocqueville and the Steve Jobs in the Harvard Business Review article. And then also in your icon, idea, and ideal exchanges. So I'm going to sort of go through, rather than sort of create these sort of lecture videos, right, to just sort of post and have you think about, I guess. I'm more inclined to sort of take your ideas and then sort of connect them in some sense in my own way, and sort of try and create a sort of collaborative reflection video for each of the modules we do. So I know we're well into module 2 and there's some great conversations going there, but since module 1 is over and done with, I think it's valuable that we sort of go back and sort of think through these things. So I'm going to get right to it so as to make this as quick as possible and concise as possible, as well as just to sort of pay tribute to all the hard work you're doing. So there's sort of 6 concepts that I came up with, and by concepts I mean sort of points of discussion that I thought were really interesting. The first is called the need for communal thinking. The second is imitation and competition with oneself, and failure. I don't mean imitation of oneself, but imitating others, but then also competing with oneself, and failure. The third is individual purpose in a larger context. Fourth is structure and organization. Fifth is challenge to democracy, conformity, and capitalism. Sounds like a lofty sort of topic, but I thought it was really interesting, some ideas coming through there. And the sixth, is diversity of viewpoints and listening toward an idea of communal individuality. So as you remember, our first module was really about diving into the self in our own fields, our own passions, our own interests, our own desires, our own ambitions, our own ideas in relation to our own fields. At the same time, thinking about notions of individuality and teamwork within the workplace. So I'm just going to sort of go through each of these concepts and sort of collect some of the quotes of the work that you've done and talk to those things in terms of how I see them connecting. The first sort of concept was called the need for communal thinking. And the first quote that sort of caught my eye, or the first sort of piece of writing that caught my eye, was Don in response to Ashley's comment on Emerson. And this is what Don said: "The type of lifestyle Emerson discusses is fraught with loneliness, inconsistency, and a desire to follow internal interests without first connecting them to the external world. I do think that people should be able to, should be free to live their own lives the way they want to. There is an element of conformity that must be obeyed to avoid chaos. It is beneficial for societies to have structure and rules that channel people toward what is best for the community as a whole, rather than only serving individual interests. In Emerson's case, in my opinion, the individual cares very little for their community and would rather seek out independence alone than use their strength to help their community." And first of all, I just really like this idea that what Emerson is talking about is really fraught with, as Don says, in response to Ashley's comment, is that it's really fraught with loneliness, inconsistency, right? And that it lacks its ability to take into consideration the community. And while we're obviously talking about grandiose things there, it connects to this notion of the workplace. Further, Carly, in her reply to Allie Klein, that is. "Unfortunately, it would take a long time for our culture to change to a more community-based system. America is extremely focused on the individual." And building upon that, to sort of keep moving forward, Justin, in responding to Cynthia, sort of shared a sort of personal story that I thought was really powerful. He says, "I've been a dialogue facilitator and tutor for many years now. But when I'm around my coworkers of my same rank level, etc., for some reason I feel that I speak and respond more than I listen. You said earlier that when they act," you referring to Cynthia, "you said earlier that when they act toward their own benefit, it's difficult to achieve the company's goals. This is exactly why I think my lack of listening skills could impact the efficacy of my group. So it is something I try to work on every day. And this was in response to the Harvard Business Review article. And I just think that idea of listening is key. If we're talking about listening, we're talking about perhaps developing a notion of communal thinking, or even a notion of communal individuality, which I think is a really interesting concept. Listening seems to be one of the keys to that formula. Finally, and this is Danny wrote this, what I agree the most is that a team needs feedback to know how they are doing. Feedback allows for people to fix their mistakes or to know what they're doing right. I think this is really key, particularly for those of you, not just in, I mean, obviously in professional fields, but also in academia. Feedback is something that's much more complex than just, you're doing this right, you're doing this wrong, or you got the question wrong, or you got the question right, or memorize this, or, whatever it might be. It's something that not only is difficult to develop, effective feedback that is, it's also something that we all need to learn how to interpret and understand. So, and that goes back to that point, Justin's point about listening. So part 2 was imitation and competition with oneself. And Brooke wrote, and I think this was in relation to the Harvard Business Review article, that in painting, before a person can find their own technique and style, they have to be able to copy other artists. Actually, I think this was in relation to Emerson, forgive me. You need to know the technical before you can get creative. A lot of people have difficulty coming out of that and end up making pieces that are almost copies of other people's works and voices. Imitation is, and I think this is a really good point that Brooke makes, imitation is useful for learning, but not in the actual creation of one's own work. And this, for me, connected to Olivia's notion, and a number of you talked about this notion of perfectionism, right? That imitation becomes this kind of practice, and that it's almost something that I can do to develop my own ideas, as Brooke implies, to develop my own ideas as a launching pad into my own ideas. So Olivia says, while perfectionism might be flawed to others, I think it's important to always strive to improve your character and your work, because it's better to care much more about your work than to care too little. And that was in the collaborative reading document as well. Once you realize that, or I'm sorry, this is in the collaborative reading document. Once you realize that you can't win everyone over, that worry you have falls away a little. Building confidence and worrying less about what people think is a harder process, but it's so important. And the way I see those two things connect is Brooke's and Olivia's comments connecting is Brooke is talking about, before a person can find their own technique and style, they have to sort of have this competition with themselves in some sense in relation to other artists, imitating other people's work, but you're really doing it to build your own style. The way Olivia is talking about having a perfectionism, but not a perfectionism that's based on making everybody happy, but a perfectionism that is expecting a lot of yourself. Justin said something too. To make a long story short, I realized that in this fashion that I need only to be in competition with myself. I need to focus on my own strengths and weaknesses. In doing so, I learn to internally draw inspiration rather than relying on external factors. Cynthia as well. I've learned that what is more important is to think for ourselves and judge our own actions based in our own experience. So this idea of that competition or that perfectionism as being a sort of competition with itself. And I thought this goes to Rebecca's point, and this comes to that failure point, right? She used for her icon, idea, and ideal. She talked about Tina Fey's autobiography, Bossy. I think it's called Bossy Pants. Forgive me if I'm getting that wrong. But Tina Fey talks about, she says bombing is painful, but it doesn't kill you. And Rebecca talked to how that really sort of has served her. And I think it's important for people to fail or bomb, as Tina Fey says, right? But you're bombing, sure, maybe some other people will let down, but you're bombing in a way you're bombing with yourself in a competition with yourself that therefore you can build from, you can learn from, and I think that's valuable and important. Third thing was individual purpose in a larger context. I thought this was really interesting. Again, I'll get right to it. Joss talked about my biggest motivation in moments of self-doubt is definitely taking a moment back to look, and this is in response to Danny's question. Danny asked a question in his icon, idea, and ideal discussion post about how to deal with conflict or struggle or challenges. And Joss said, my biggest motivation in moments of self-doubt is definitely taking a moment to look at the bigger picture, look at my progress, where I stand, and acknowledge my hard work. Further, in her own icon, idea, and ideal post, Joss talked about Mark Zuckerberg, and a quote from Mark Zuckerberg is that purpose is that feeling that you are part of something bigger than yourself, that you are needed, and that you have something better ahead to work for. Purpose is what creates true happiness, unquote. And I think both those things are interesting in the sense that we talked about that competition with oneself, but then also connecting that to a sort of larger purpose, right? not only in terms of the scheme of the work you're doing, but also in terms of your own sort of career arc. Similarly, I thought it was really Nick brought up, you know, his relationship to history, his interest in teaching history and researching history. And he said, by having a grasp on elements of history, I can make connections, and through these connections, I can analyze the events which have shaped my life, location, politics, worldview, etc. But because history is a field which has been taught, for the most part, completely incorrectly, making these connections will require that I dive more into a lifetime's worth of misinformation. But I like Nick's point that understanding one's context, whether we're talking about one's career, one's life, even in the context of one's own sort of ambitions, is really valuable in terms of understanding that sense of purpose. Picking up on this, Carly, who talked about Gregory Crutzen, photographer, describes this idea or quotes Gregory Crutzen, and this is in the Icon Idea and Ideal post, that to me, the most powerful moment in the whole process is when everything comes together, and for that instance, my life makes sense. Ali, similarly, and this is Ali Lamming, I think it's Lamming, forgive me, Ali, if I'm mispronouncing that, but I believe we all have our own unique purposes in life, mine being through teaching, yours may be through finances, medicine, journalism, athletics, law, and entertainment, but if we do not know what the difference we can make in the world, then what's the point? So there's this interesting combination of this purpose and then this connection to a larger context, an individual purpose, connection to a larger context, the bigger picture. It starts to make sense, as contradictory as perhaps they might be. So the fourth thing is structure and organization, and I'll get through this really quick. I realize, you know, I'm coming up on 12 minutes here. Both Justin, interesting enough, both Justin and Felix talk towards the idea of and Ali Lamming, again replying to Justin about, to-do lists. Right. I mean, Justin said, I like to make to-do lists on pen and paper because I feel it works better, that I can refer to. It provides me with structures so that I can know what I'm working towards. I feel that it's important for any business to employ the practicality. Ali said, I too am an organized person who likes to plan. Without one, I feel lost and severely unmotivated. Felix talked about his use of Google Keep, right, and creating to-do lists. And further, Maura talked about paying attention to details. As shown, and how that's a characteristic that she really likes. It's a little bit different there, but she was talking about the CSI show and this character of Barry Allen, but the idea of having to pay attention to details. So that structure and organization, attention to detail on even just the practical levels within our own day-to-day doings, I think is really valuable. So that larger purpose that we're talking about, but also having that kind of organization structure seems to be really valuable to a lot of people. Lastly, I just want to say Ashley replied to Ali Klein, saying that to me, life has more meaning when you're trying to reach a goal and have the excitement of being able to achieve something to be proud of. So that organization gives us those kind of intermittent moments, if you will, these moments of accomplishment where we're starting to achieve towards a much larger goal. And these things seem obvious, right? I mean, they're cliche. Many of you talked about in your writings that a lot of these things come off as cliche. Sorry if you can hear my newborn son in the background. That's the beauty and the wonder of having a child. Anyways, having those, all these steps in which I can organize towards that goal. It's something we talk a lot about, these things become cliche, but it's something that's really, I think, important to remind yourself even to do those things. You hear a lot about in these sort of self-help books or these how to become a millionaire books, like doing at least, one or two things every day, even small things that help you to achieve or move towards whatever goal is, or organize your thoughts or structure your thoughts, and then thinking later about how that applies to the larger context. Two more things to talk about. So the other one is challenges to democracy, conformity, and capitalism. And this is where we're thinking about a larger context, again, of that notion of American exceptionalism versus individuality. And Don wrote about de Tocqueville, saying that he challenges the notion of extreme individuality, sort of as represented by Emerson. And she says, quote, by suggesting that in relaxing the social structure and hierarchy, people are no longer confined to their classes but to themselves. They become trapped by their personal identities because without connections or lineage, they are useless. The individual no longer has a need to invest in others, just as they do not expect an investment in themselves. Really interesting idea about how our social structures actually link us to one another rather than divide us. We most often talk about them, how they divide us. But it's interesting, you know, if we emphasize individuality too much, perhaps, as Don implies, and as de Tocqueville, I think, is arguing, is that perhaps we lose the idea of community. Adriana, in response to Reagan, said, this is important to remember because there's constant pressure, especially for college students, to all follow the traditional path of graduating, staying with the same job for a number of years, then retiring. When an individual makes a choice different than the others, they're often seen as weird or out of place, but they could be making a lasting impact on the world and leaving a legacy for themselves. Ali Klein, that is, says something similar. From an early age, we're all taught to fall in line. It starts in most education systems, right, where you must raise your hand to speak and there is only one right answer. Sort of what I was talking about earlier. As we grow with these lessons instilled in our head, all sense of creativity begins to disappear. So two sort of sides of this coin. Perhaps this notion of balance between this kind of individuality, yes, as Ali and Adriana are talking to, but also we need to achieve that individuality in sort of response and in a kind of dance, if you will, and an exchange and conversation with a sort of structured system, right? That system, though, can be very problematic. And Nick, actually, I think, brings up a really point, and this is in his reply to Danny about Steve Jobs. He says, that being said, I find this quote funny coming from Steve Jobs, the face of one of the world's largest corporations. As Jobs may have once been an innovator in the world of tech, his later life saw him become a face of global capitalism, which isn't exactly all that rule-breaking. Right? The idea that we sometimes mistake, I think it's a good point. And well, let me just agree with this on a personal level. From my personal opinion, I think that we see sort of extreme capitalism, even exploitive capitalism, as this notion of great individuality and freedom. But if we think about that in relation to Don's comment, it sort of makes sense, right? So challenging that system, right, is the point of a democratic system, in my opinion. Least. And I think that's what some of you are getting at. You know, Reagan says we have turned into one of the most isolated, narcissistic countries there are. If we stop and think we can fix that. Ashley, when she's talking about the movie 12 Angry Men, says the duty of an attorney at law to not let their own interpretation get masked by ideology. So that I'm not always just towing the company line or the workplace line or the ideology of where I'm working. I actually am finding ways to inroads as to innovate and change and challenge those things, something that we're going to talk about or we are talking about in our second module. Okay, lastly, in just a couple more minutes here, was the diversity of viewpoints and listening. I talked a little bit about the listening that you know, feedback and listening that both Danny and Justin talk about, and this idea of a communal individuality. You know, Rebecca talked about this, how communal individuality, when she said the Montclarian, I believe, covered the MSU walkout. You know, Rebecca said there were different reporters on the scene in different places around the campus. Each of us reported on what we saw and talked to the people that were there. Everyone submitted a different story, which gave readers a variety of perspectives of the event. And because everyone reported correctly, it worked out very well. I thought this is a really interesting comment by Rebecca in the sense that we live in this age where, you know, fake news and alternative facts and all this stuff, right? How's it that one of the values of journalism, can be, or of any perspective or teamwork, is that everybody has an individual perspective, and we should respect that. At the same time that we understand and respect the fact that the correct version of events is going to be different from person to person to person to person, right? In fact, that maybe we get at a more correct version by having the more diverse versions we have, you know. I think that's a really interesting point, and not something we normally think about when we're thinking about individuality. We're usually thinking about who's got the greatest stylized version, which usually means who's got the version that agrees with our viewpoints the best. Olivia brings up a good point. For a team to be successful, it must contain a group of people who all have their strengths and skills. They all have to be willing to put forth those skills in order to collaborate with one another to complete their project. And this is something that Brooke mentioned, too, in relation to the writer's room. Right? She says, for example, you know, writers on a television show. You know, she says, let's say there's a show about growing up in a trailer park. Just as an example, the writer's room would mostly have a writer who grew up on a trailer park. That person would be able to give input that no other writer on the team could give, and they have experience that no other writer would have. At the same time, it couldn't be a whole room of people that grew up in trailer parks. There needs to be diversity and multiple points of view to create good, dynamic work. This is a small, it seems like a smaller point, but I think it's just as important. This also keeps the room itself more interesting, the work more interesting. The fact that I'm working with people who maybe disagree with me or have different ideas or come from a totally different background or place actually makes things more lively and more valuable. Finally, just a few more. this goes to sort of technology, and Adriana brought this up. While distance and digital communication can be seen as negatively, it's often seen as a lot of negatives. Technology. These new aspects can allow individuals to expand on their previous knowledge and have open forms of communication with people from all over the world, right? But I think the starter to that, this exposure to diversity was not possible in the past. As Adriana says, this exposure is something that we need to understand. We need to become literate in, appreciating and enjoying all those diversity of perspectives. Felix quoted Tom Scott saying that, right, you look at the people who have been there before you and you thank them very much for making it open source, talking about a code, and you give them credit and you take what they have made and you put it in your program and you never look at it again because that waylays madness. But this idea that we shouldn't just pretend we made it up all ourselves. We should use those who have come before us, as partners in some sense, as collaborators, as a community with which we can develop our own ideas, right? And discover the new challenges and discover the new problems that we can work through. Finally, just a quote from Carly that I thought was really interesting. She said, "My dad once told me, a smart person is not the one who knows all of the answers, but someone who knows where to find the answers." And she's talking about using Google. As a teacher, I do this all the time. When a student asks me, how do I do this? I'm like, Google it. I mean, that's what I do. Even when it's kind of like citing something or something like that, I don't have all that stuff memorized. Go Google it. Or if I have a problem with my computer, if I have a problem with anything, I go and look it up. And the ability to have that willingness, so that willingness that willingness to go do those things is really important in terms of this idea of listening, letting other people, I think it was somebody was talking about, Brooke was talking about Larry David's show. Seinfeld. Larry David being the creator of Seinfeld, and how he took a back seat, right, when it came to starring in the show. He obviously stars in his own show, but back then he took himself out of the show. So he was forced behind the ideas, but he was also knew when to sort of step back. And that was something that people talked about. And then we can perhaps, that listening, that feedback, that communication, that respect of a diversity of viewpoints, then we can start to, as well as understanding, having your own sense of organization, having your own sense of a larger purpose, having a sense of a larger ambition, all those things sort of coming together, maybe we can get to a notion of a sort of more communal individuality. All right, guys, really great work in the this first module, and I hope this video was useful. Just a lot of really interesting ideas out there, and I hope I tried to touch on as many as I could, and I'm not even close to my time that I was hoping to stay within. So thank you for listening, and thanks for all the hard work. I hope you're learning as much as I am from all the different people in this class, and I will see you, I guess, in a video at least after the next module. All right, take care.